Hi, my name is Johanna. I'm an advanced conversational hypnotherapist and coach, and I specialize in postpartum mental health. So you're watching this video mostly because you have gone through a traumatic birthing experience, or because after birth, or maybe during pregnancy, you feel like your mental health is in decline. And that's horrible. You know, when you become a parent, you want to be thriving and not feel like you're surviving. So whether you went through a traumatic event, or whether you feel that your mental health is in decline, whether you are the birthing parent or the partner or an adoptive parent or a grandparent, whatever, thing is, you want to be thriving. You want to be there to love this little newborn. And we don't want to suffer. And some of us do suffer, and some of us don't recognize the signs and symptoms of suffering. And we go into that survival mode instead of the thrival mode that we want to be in. So this video is dedicated it's for me to tell you what you may be suffering from and how to overcome it. So it's really important to recognize the signs and symptoms. And then I'll start with PTSD, because post-traumatic stress disorder is there very often when somebody has gone through a traumatizing experience after birth or during birth. And especially when it involves life-threatening situation, you know, significant medical intervention, or even the perceived lack of control. All these things can contribute to and lead to PTSD. And the symptoms that you may be experiencing, or that you may see your spouse or a loved one experiencing around this period of time, the birth, it can be things like flashbacks or nightmares, hypervigilance, maybe avoidance behaviors. And there's also something called birth-related PTSD. And that really is specific towards PTSD related to a traumatic birthing experience. And that involves symptoms like very often intrusive thinking, horrible thoughts around your baby or about your baby. Often also avoidance of reminders of the birth, emotional distress when thinking about the birth. These are all classic signs and symptoms. Often seen are anxiety disorders after traumatic births or traumatic pregnancies, and they can trigger various anxiety disorders like generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, a panic disorder, lots of panic attacks, specific phobias related to the childbirth, that can all be triggered by anxiety. Also very often heard is PPD, postpartum depression, unfortunately a well-known condition that can occur following childbirth, but a traumatic birth experience can really increase the risk of developing a depression, and not just in the postpartum period, but that can really drag on into later in life. So again, you want to be thriving as a parent, not surviving. And when you go into a depression and that lasts a lot longer than it should, because you don't recognize the signs and symptoms, and maybe you're not asking help or not receiving the proper help, that can really spiral out of control for a longer period of time, well into your children's life. And again, we want to be thriving and not stuck in depression mode. So be on the lookout for these symptoms, not just directly after the birth, but also the period after that. What we also often see is attachment issues, you know, difficulties bonding with your newborn because of the traumatic experience that you went through. You're not attaching to them. Often when babies are taken away because of medical things that needed to happen, a mum feels that because I wasn't able to hug my baby straight away, I'm not bonding properly. And then the brain sort of kicks into believing mode. And even though if it's hours after, you can really still bond with your child, but that's something that can really we can detach from that. And yeah, we can go into a disorder called attachment issues. And, that can cause lots and lots of emotional challenges for both the parent and the child in the long run. It can really affect the parent-child relationship. And again, that's not why you wanted to make a new life in the world. You wanted to love them. That's most likely why you wanted a baby, and not to feel detached from them. What we also often see is substance abuse, a substance abuse disorder. So that's when you turn to substances as a way to cope with the emotional pain and the distress caused by a traumatic birth. For example, alcohol or drugs or medication, sleeping pills. I have to get this right. It's somatization disorder. I always struggle with that word. So a somatic disorder, that's when trauma sort of physically starts to manifest in our bodies in the form of unexplained physical symptoms, where, psychological distress starts to express itself through physical complaints. So maybe you have a rash and you can't explain why you have it, or itching or bloating, headaches, pain in your neck, pain in your shoulders, bowel problems, heart palpitations. These are all bodily functions, somatic bodily functions that sort of come and go, and you can't explain why, and they can mess with your mental health because they can be scary. And basically, they're caused by the stress that you're feeling. It's basically a warning sign of your unconscious mind trying to notify you that the stress is getting too much, and it's now starting to express itself through a somatic disorder, through bodily functions that are not functioning the way they're supposed to function. Mood disorders, lots of different mood disorders can become because of a traumatic birth experience. And they can be very severe, like a bipolar disorder in very, very extreme cases. Also, a dissociative disorder. Again, in severe cases, that can happen where you may develop things like dissociative identity, which is often, the feeling that you're observing yourself from the outside of your own body, as if you're sort of in a dreamlike state. That can give you a sense of unreality about yourself. It's a very distorted sense of time, for example. Emotional numbness, you're not feeling anything. I have made a video about this where I go into detail about this type of postpartum disorder. So if you recognize any of these signs and symptoms, or you feel concerned that that is maybe something that you or a loved one is going through, then maybe it's worth checking out that video about dissociative disorders, dissociation. Another thing is adjustment disorder, when someone may have difficulty coping with the emotional aftermath of the birth experience, and it then starts to regurgitate the story continuously. I went through that myself. I remember sitting in my car to work, which was often an hour and a half into work and often an hour and a half back from work, and I would go through and live through every detail of the story continuously. And you can imagine that sort of continuously going over a story again and again and again in detail, that keeps you in that unhealthy emotional place, that keeps you in that stress, in that anxiety, in that sadness. And that can then, in the long run, really become a disorder because you can't detach yourself from it anymore. OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, that happens very often due to traumatic events, including traumatic birthing experience. That can really either trigger OCD or exacerbate its symptoms. And very often people think of OCD as cleaning and keeping things tidy, which is true. So, you know, if you find yourself obsessively cleaning your house or cooking your baby's food until perfection, I've heard stories of clients that threw lots of food out every time that there was only the slightest doubt of it maybe not being healthy or endangering their baby. And that can really mess with your time schedule and your mental health and put you under a lot of stress. You know, cleaning continuously, definitely signs and symptoms of OCD, but OCD may also involve intrusive, repetitive thoughts, like obsessive thoughts. And also, as I said before, there's real ritualistic behavior, so that those are the compulsions. But going back to these intrusive thoughts, it's good to know that up to 90% of new mums apparently develop intrusive thoughts to a certain extent after childbirth. Fortunately, not all develop disorders because of it. It's just a small part of it. It's very uncomfortable, but it goes away with time. But for some, they really develop into a disorder, which then starts messing with your mental health. So if you recognize these intrusive thoughts, again, they don't have to become a big issue, but it can. And again, I've also made a video about intrusive thinking postpartum or during the pregnancy, which may be worth your while watching. It's on my YouTube channel. And it gives you lots of tips and tricks on how to deal with it and how maybe advanced conversational hypnotherapy can get you, help you get rid of the really severe ones as well. Another thing that I just thought of just now, my head is spinning, social anxiety disorder. You know, after a traumatic birth, that can sort of really contribute to social anxiety, particularly if it involves maybe feelings of embarrassment or humiliation during childbirth. So maybe you're blaming yourself for not. I'll give you an example here. I had a lady in my practice who felt immense guilt and really embarrassed because she had smoked during her pregnancy, not half as much as she used to smoke. She found it really hard to kick the habit, but she did occasionally have a cigarette because the stress of not smoking was really getting to her during the pregnancy. And when things became hard during the birth, she started to really blame herself for smoking because she had sort of anchored that as that being the issue of her baby potentially not being healthy and herself also having a lot of health issues during the birth. And then she went into sort of social isolation mode because of that, because she was so afraid that people would judge her and would blame her for the difficult birth. And in the long run, that really, really messed with her mental health. She came to me when her child was, I think, 5, and she had a huge disorder all around social anxiety, and it all really sort of went back in time to her smoking during pregnancy. So that can really mess with your mental health as well. An eating disorder. Very often, eating disorders have a root cause in trauma, and you know, a traumatic birthing event may lead to you developing that, or again, like the OCD, exacerbating it, and you going into anorexia nervosa or bulimia nervosa, as people may go to use disordered eating behaviors as sort of a coping mechanism for dealing with the traumatic event. Personality disorders, I think, did I mention them before? I'm not sure now, but they can potentially influence the development or exacerbate after a childbirth. And they can be as severe as going into borderline personality disorder or maybe avoidant personality disorder, which also again links into the social anxiety. They all sort of link in together. I have also made a video on postpartum psychosis versus postpartum depression, because psychotic disorders are extremely rare, fortunately, but unfortunately they do every now and again happen, which and psychosis is a very, very extreme reaction to trauma. And yeah, that can go into schizophrenia and psychosis and excuse me, things like that happening to you. Excuse me. And very often there is, it's worth mentioning, there is a genetic predisposition. But you may want to check out that video, because sometimes when people suffer from very, very bad postpartum depression, they are afraid that it is postpartum psychosis, which is very often is not. So it's good to know the difference between the signs and symptoms, and it's good to know where to go for help, because that's just a horrible place to be in, like all the other disorders, obviously. There's also something called NSSE, which is non-suicidal self-injury, which is when you, after your traumatic experience, you go into self-harming behavior, but they won't be self-harming to end your life, but they will be self-harming to sort of cope with emotional distress, like cutting yourself or burning yourself. Now, sleep disorders, unfortunately, they're fairly common when it comes to childbirth, but the trauma can really disrupt sleep patterns. And again, if they continue long enough, they can lead to the development of really severe sleep disorders like insomnia. Or also, I've had in my practice a couple of times people who had extreme nightmares related to the traumatic birth, and so bad that they were afraid to go to sleep, or they couldn't, well, they messed with their sleep patterns. And we all know that having a baby can be very, very tiring. But this sleep disorder is really next level sleep disruption. Now, all these disorders, they're all names. And I really want to stress here that, you may recognize a lot of the symptoms that I spoke about. And it doesn't necessarily automatically mean that you have a specific mental disorder. Oh, sorry, I just knocked something over, that you have that specific mental health disorder. It may mean that you are developing some issues and struggles that can potentially go into something that can really long-term mess with your mental health. Not everybody who experiences a traumatic birth will develop mental health disorder. Some people who don't go through traumatic birth will still develop mental health issues. There's a relationship between trauma and mental health, and it's very complex, and the responses vary widely. So, you may experience all of the above. You may experience only one or two of the above. It's all wording. Medical professionals, therapists, they like to label things because it makes them easier to deal with. But that doesn't necessarily mean you have it, and you don't have to be labeled with it. And you can overcome it. And that's probably the most important part of the message that I'm trying to send you with this video. You are experiencing mental health issues and potentially going into mental health decline because of these struggles at a time when you want to be thriving instead of surviving. So if you recognize any of the above, my advice would be take small steps. And the first step is to verbalize it, communicate, and try to seek help, because there is a lot of help out there. Like all these different labels, there is all sorts of different modalities and therapeutic interventions, medication that you can take to help you along and to help you overcome these mental health struggles that you're facing. Maybe you don't find the therapeutic intervention that works for you straight away. Maybe you need to try some different things. Maybe you are labeled with different things. Maybe you're labeled with absolutely nothing. The thing is, you deserve to be enjoying and thriving in motherhood or in parenthood instead of surviving. So open up about it. Recognize that there's something going on that's not right, that doesn't feel comfortable, that feels negative. And that will be your first step towards help, to verbalize it, to start looking for help. A label is just a label. Your struggles, that's where the focus needs to be. so that you can go back to finding a balanced way of living and start enjoying living your life with your baby instead of not making memories or making unhappy memories. They're only small for such a small time, for such a short amount of time. And every mom, every dad, every baby deserve to have a loving family. So open up about it, get help. If you have any questions or you think that I can help you, please reach out, because motherhood can be absolutely beautiful, and it rushes past, time rushes past. It's time to start thriving and enjoying it. I really hope that inspires you and helps you to go to the next step that you need to take now. Take care.